I'm Sam Fuqua, joined in the studio by David Barsamian, the director of Alternative Radio, the syndicated national program produced right here in Boulder. David recently returned from a trip to Turkey, Lebanon, and Syria. We're going to talk about that and also take some of your questions and comments when we open up the phone lines a bit later in the program. David, welcome back to Boulder and KGNU.
Good morning.
Well, you were in Turkey, Lebanon, and Syria. My first question is, where did you feel safest?
Syria. Without question, it is pretty much a police state. It was like visiting, I've been there before, but it was like visiting Eastern Europe in the 1970s and 80s. There are pictures of Big Brother everywhere. Bashar Assad, who's the president, he's the son of the former president, Hafez al-Assad. And underneath these, I can read enough Arabic to decipher, underneath these grand portraits are slogans like, "The people are with you now and forever. We are steadfast in support of our leader." Those kinds of things.
What do the people say about that? Is there a dissident movement in Syria?
Well, there is indeed. In fact, I had the opportunity and privilege of interviewing one of the leading dissidents. His name is Yassin al-Haj Saleh. He served 16 years in jails under Hafez al-Assad. He was released in the mid-1990s. He said the best thing the United States could do for the democracy movement in Syria was to get out of Iraq and to stop interfering in the internal affairs of the region. I was surprised, actually. I thought it would be very difficult to access the internet in Syria. There are internet cafes everywhere. They're unmonitored, unmediated. I was reading the BBC and the New York Times and, doing email, of course. So that was a very interesting kind of development, the electronic penetration. Now, there's still government control of the print media. There are official newspapers. But Syria's, like all of the countries in the region, it's a very complex society. It's multiracial, multilingual. It's ruled, in fact, by a Alawite, which is kind of a Shia sect. About only 10% of the country is Alawite. That is the Assad family. They are mostly from the Latakia region in northwestern Syria, right on the coast.
Mm-hmm. Syria is often accused itself of interfering with affairs of other countries in the region.
Well, that's a constant trope of U.S. propaganda. The countries in the region are accused of, why would they, meddling in the internal affairs of other countries. So it is only the United States propaganda system that can pull off such astonishing declarations that Iran is meddling in the internal affairs of Iraq, or Syria is meddling in the internal affairs in Lebanon, for example. Meanwhile, the United States has a massive military force in Iraq. It is threatening Iran with military action, and it is also interfering in Lebanon to a great extent. It has pretty much set up a puppet government there run by Fuad Sanyora. This is the March 14th group.
Say more about how the Iraq War is affecting the entire region, based on your observations of your recent trip.
I don't think most Americans appreciate the scale of the catastrophe and the debacle of Iraq and what it has meant for the Iraqi people, particularly. Of course, everyone knows about the almost 3,600 U.S. soldiers killed. We learn their names, their ages, their hobbies, their career goals, the name of their fiancé and or of their children, etc. But we know very little about the Iraqis. They are largely invisible. The refugee crisis now in Iraq is the largest and most acute in the world. The internal displacement alone from ethnic cleansing is over 2 million. Over 2 million have fled the country, primarily, it's probably 2.5 to 3 million, primarily to Syria and Jordan, and I can talk about the Iraqis I met in Syria in just a moment. The public educational system has collapsed. 2 out of 3 Iraqi children do not go to school. There are tens of thousands of orphans being very poorly cared for. In terms of the refugee crisis, if you prorate the Iraqi population, let's say put the same grid on a U.S. population of 30 million, it would be 50 million Americans as refugees. 50 million. The population of Iraq is about 24, 25 million. So 1/6 of that is 4 million. 1/6 of 300 million is 50 million.
Where are these 2 million people living now? You mentioned Syria and Jordan, in camps or what?
There has been ethnic cleansing in some instances inside of Iraq. They have moved into the homes of Sunnis, or the Sunnis have moved into the homes of the Shia. Many are moving to Kurdistan, which is a kind of enclave in the north, which has a lot of autonomy and some degree of safety, although there have been increasing bombing attacks in Kurdistan. Across the borders in Syria and Jordan primarily, although in Turkey and Lebanon as well there are Iraqi refugees, probably 2.5 to 3 million. This is putting an enormous burden on Jordan and Syria. This is a situation created by the U.S. war of aggression and the ongoing occupation, and it is a criminal aggression against the UN Charter and against the Iraqi people. The burden on the Syrian economy is extreme, and it's creating an enormous social problems inside of Syria. For example, a lot of women who have lost their husbands, their fathers, their family structure is destroyed, are turning to prostitution. There's a whole area outside of Damascus which has turned into a kind of, Iraqi bordello. It's tragic. I mean, desperate people do desperate things. They'll do anything to feed their children. And again, the United States is doing very little, almost nothing, to support the refugees in Syria and Jordan. It, in fact, has one of the lowest quotas for immigration for Iraqis in the world. I'm still trying to check out this figure, but as in the year 2007 alone, the number of Iraqi refugees that have been permitted to enter the United States is in the single digits. I mean, this is just breathtaking. In its moral depravity, creating a problem and then not addressing it by being generous with financial aid as well as opening up the immigration quotas. So the situation, inside of Syria is becoming. I talk to many Syrians. They're feeling uncomfortable with this large Iraqi presence. I talked to a number of Iraqis. I was staying at a hotel where it looked like the elite from a particular city in Iraq were all staying at this hotel. They're from the city of Mosul, which is the third largest city after Baghdad and Basra. And there were doctors and lawyers and architects. The brains of Iraq have largely left the country because they can. Number one, they're privileged. They have language abilities. They have some financial resources. And so I met this one guy whose name is Mahmoud, whose car was run over by an American tank. And he went to the American military headquarters and said, well, what are you going to do about this? And he was simply dismissed. He had photographs of his car. It was simply parked in the street, and it was destroyed by this tank. And then he told me a really interesting thing. He spoke perfect English, and he said, I hate the American soldiers in Iraq. And when they speak to me in English, I never respond in English. I only speak in Arabic. They are in our country. They should be speaking Arabic. And of course, very few of the Americans do. So there was a good deal of bitterness in Mahmoud's voice. He is one of, again, fairly privileged because he is a mechanical engineer. He's applying for a visa to Australia. Another guy I met was an orthopedic surgeon. He called himself a dead man walking in Iraq. Why? Because his name is Omar, or Umar in Arabic. Omar is a name only given to Sunnis. So if you show up at a checkpoint or, manned by Shia militias or Shia police, and you say your name is Omar, it's lights out. It's all over. He fled the country. He's waiting for a visa to go to Denmark and then possibly to Sweden. Sweden has accepted something like 25,000 Iraqi refugees. He was also very, very bitter about the American invasion. Now, these were, very educated people. I don't speak enough Arabic to really carry on a conversation, so they all spoke, English and very well. But the pall of Iraq is simply transforming the entire Middle East. It's having an effect on Lebanon, where there are now Qaeda groups operating that have been trained in Iraq, that have had combat experience in Iraq. And I met Lebanese. I met a Lebanese in Sidon, which is a large city right on the coast. And he said he wanted to go to Iraq to kill Americans. So this is the situation that this war has created, and I don't think it is appreciated enough the scale of the tragedy for the Iraqi people.
David Barsamian is our guest from Alternative Radio. He's just returned from a trip to Lebanon, Syria, and Turkey. His new book, Targeting Iran, just out on the
City Lights.
On the City Lights press label. He'll be talking about it and signing copies next Wednesday evening at Left Hand Books in Boulder. And if you'd like to join the conversation, our phone number is 303-442-4242, 303-442-4242. If you'd like to speak with David Barsamian, it's 847 at KGNU. Back to Lebanon, you had been there prior to the July 2006 war. Can you compare that visit to your recent visit?
Well, I went to southern Lebanon, which was largely destroyed. Some of it has been reconstructed, but in one particular village, Bin Jebel, is still rubble. It's like, I can't imagine what Dresden or Hamburg were like in World War II in Germany after being, carpet bombed by the U.S. and British air forces. But it certainly looked like that. Also, areas of southern Beirut, the Dahia, are still largely rubble. And what was really stunning was the depths of the craters in the ground. Not only were the buildings, demolished, but 2 to 3 stories into the ground. There were these large holes created by these bunker buster bombs that were dropped in an entirely civilian neighborhood. There were no military targets in Dahia. This is not an area of controversy or debate, nor do the Israelis who carried out the bombing even claim that there were any valid military targets in southern Beirut. This is where Hezbollah, which is a largely Shia party, has most of its infrastructure in terms of TV and radio stations, its headquarters and welfare offices, etc. So the situation in Lebanon right now is very, very fragile. I mentioned that the U.S. is supporting the government of Fuad Sanyora, and there is an opposition group, the Muadara, which consists not only of Hezbollah, which is a Shia formation, but also of Michel Aoun, the former president of Lebanon, a military general, who happens to be a Christian. So there are and there's also an Armenian party that is supporting Hezbollah. So it's not correct to say that this is entirely a Shia-led opposition. But the Americans are trying to recreate a Lebanon where it was largely a banking center, a financial center that would be considered pro-Western, to bring it back into the U.S. orbit. And there is some resistance. There is a great deal of resistance to this. The opposition parties have walked out of parliament. The government is completely paralyzed. Nothing is being accomplished. The $7 billion in aid that was given to Lebanon after the war, largely from Europe and some from the United States, has not gone into reconstruction, but has gone off to paying Lebanon's largest per capita debt in the world. It has a per capita, Lebanon's debt is about $42 billion. $42 billion. The population of the country is less than 3 million. You can do the math. It's the largest per capita debt in the world. So it's servicing interest payments rather than, rebuilding Lebanon. Now, I must say that some roads have been repaired. When I went to Syria, though, the major bridge connection was still down. But when I went to southern Lebanon, some of the roads had been repaired. But as I reported, some villages are still completely rubble.
Let's take a phone call. Caller, I didn't get your name, but you're on the air with David Barsamian. Hello? Good morning, caller.
Hello?
Yes, it's you. You're on the air.
Oh, me?
Yes.
There's somebody else on the air.
All right, thanks for that call. We're at 303-442-4242 if you'd like to join our conversation with David Barsamian. His new book is called Targeting Iran, and he'll be talking about it next Wednesday at Left Hand Books.
Let me just mention Iran, because when you travel and drive around the south, you see signs that this town or this village or this road has been reconstructed with the help of the people of Iran. So Iran has a major presence in Lebanon. It's openly acknowledged. They have close political, cultural, religious ties with Hezbollah. And so that is continuing as well. Seymour Hersh had an interesting article in the New Yorker a few months ago called The Redirection, in which he claimed that the United States, along with that great liberal democracy, Saudi Arabia, are both promoting Sunni jihadist groups in an effort to tamper down Hezbollah's power and influence in Lebanon. And it was interesting to see that such groups are now operating in Lebanon that heretofore didn't even exist, that no one even knew about, names that are totally new to the Lebanese, like Fatah Islam, Jund al-Sham, the Aspat al-Ansar. These are operating inside of Lebanon now. And the information I got was that these people, these jihadis, many of whom had fought in Iraq, again, the spillover, the constant reverberation of Iraq. Many of these jihadis had trained there. They came into Lebanon through the airport. Now, the airport is controlled by the Senora government, that is the sitting regime in Beirut. It is simply not plausible that hundreds and hundreds of young men fitting this profile, between 20 and 35, could come into the Beirut airport without the government knowing about it. They didn't come in overland through Syria, as the U.S. claims and as the Beirut government claims, but they came in through the airport.
How do you know that?
I had a conversation with Robert Fisk about this. He checked it out. Other Lebanese told me they all came in through the airport.
Well, with the government paralyzed, with the foreign aid money going to pay off the debt rather than rebuild the country, and with these groups operating now within Lebanon that have never been there before, these Qaeda-type groups, what is the way forward for the country?
Well, it seems that there has to be a less interference from the United States. I mean, the United States, through Condoleezza Rice primarily, has been trying to construct a coalition of the willing inside of Lebanon that has no credibility among large numbers of the Lebanese people, particularly the Shia, who constitute the largest single group inside the country. They're about 45% of the total population. And I met also many, it's tragic to talk about Lebanon Lebanon and Syria and all of these countries now in terms of Sunni, Shia, Christian. But part of the U.S. policy, of course, has been to accentuate these sectarian differences in order to create divisions, in order to create a stronger U.S. presence by bifurcating and debilitating body politics, so to speak. And so many Sunni Lebanese communist leftists are also very unhappy with the Suniora government. They see it as a collaborationist regime with the U.S. and, the way forward is for the United States to disengage itself from Lebanon. The way forward is for Lebanon to face its demographic realities, that is, to hold an election, to hold a census, which it has not had since 1932. This is something I've talked about in the past. The entire political structure is based on a fantasy of a Maronite Christian and Sunni majority, which is not the case at all. As I said, the Shia are now the largest single group inside the country. So there needs to be justice. There needs to be political justice in Lebanon, and that's economic justice will then follow. But as long as the parliament, you see the way the Lebanese constitution is structured, the president has to be a Maronite Christian. The prime minister has to be a Sunni Muslim. These are the two most powerful positions in the country. The Speaker of the Parliament, which is a much less important and influential position, is given to a Shia Muslim. And so this situation has to change, and it has to come from inside. It doesn't have to come from, if Washington thinks it's going to impose a solution on Lebanon, I think it's going to create a possible civil war.
We're speaking with David Barsamian from Alternative Radio, just back from a trip to Lebanon, Syria, and Turkey. It's 3 minutes before 9 o'clock. This is KGNU Boulder, KGNU Denver. The number to call to join the conversation, 303-442-4242, 303-442-4242. Dan from Boulder is on the line. Hi, Dan.
Good morning.
You have a question or comment?
Yes. Israel, of course, attacked Lebanon last year, and there is much talk about Israel being behind a push to attack Iran. How does the Israeli political scene work within this context, and what's also happening in Gaza, David?
Well, there are multiple questions inside there. Prime Minister Ehud Olmert is intensely unpopular inside of Israel, much more unpopular than the even befuddled and bewildered George W. Bush here in the United States. But there isn't a lot of support for Israeli military action against Lebanon, but Israeli attacks against Gaza continue uninterrupted and with very little comment from Washington. Clearly, Israel has a green light to do essentially whatever it wants in the region. This is not a breaking news story, by the way. This is 40 years of occupation, colonization, annexation. I do want to say something that I neglected to point out in terms of Syria, which is not discussed very much in the corporate media, nor in really the alternative media very much, and that is the annexation of the Syrian Golan Heights. This was occupied by Israel in 1967. It was formally annexed into Israeli territory in 1981 in clear violation of who knows how many Security Council resolutions, UN Charter, Geneva Conventions, etc., etc. Again, Israel seems to have a permanent get-out-of-jail pass on these kinds of issues. What was interesting, and I learned for the first time, was that the Golan Heights, which is an elevated plateau separating right in the corner between Lebanon and Syria and Israel, supplies Israel with 30% of its water. Water is gold in this arid region. It is more than gold. It is the future. And so that is a very interesting, resource question that I had not fully appreciated before. Every Syrian I spoke to said, we want our land back. This is non-negotiable. However, the Olmert government, as well as other previous governments in Tel Aviv, continue to insist on Syria meeting preconditions before Israel will even sit down with Syria to discuss the return of the Golan Heights. There cannot be any peace in the Middle East, if in fact that's at all, the goal of these various regimes in Washington, particularly, without the return of the Golan Heights to Syria. This is a very important issue. It's way beyond symbolism for the Syrians. So that's an important thing to, I think, keep on our agenda. We hear a lot about, the West Bank and Gaza, but nothing about annexed Golan Heights. Now, in terms of Gaza, there was an election, an open democratic election in January of 2006, where Hamas was the choice of the Palestinian people. What was the response from the liberal democratic European community, the EU, as well as Washington? It was to impose on the Palestinian people one of the most punishing sanctions regimes ever seen, cutting off all economic aid, including humanitarian aid to some extent, and causing enormous suffering on the Palestinian people for choosing a government that they did not approve of. Imagine if the rest of the world imposed sanctions on the United States for twice or at least once electing George W. Bush. Would we think that was fair and just and something pleasurable?
I think it would be fair and just.
Well, there are a number of people that might join you on that. Now, the way forward, as Sam said, is through negotiation. You have to talk to your adversary, no matter how much you despise him, loathe him or her, or feel antagonism toward him. And so it's crucial that that the parties sit down and talk. There's clearly a lack of interest on the part of the parties to do that right now. The annexation colonization program continues unabated, unimpeded. Most of the West Bank now. Let me speak clearly in English. The possibilities of a viable Palestinian state are nil. And to even talk about a viable state is, I think, not realistic. The area is completely separated and cut off through a network of roads for Israelis only, colonies, settlements that have cut off towns and villages and cities from one another, a wall which has annexed an additional 10% of the West Bank, and no one talks about the Jordan Valley, which is a very fertile area of the West Bank. It has been completely taken over by Israel. So what kind of state can this possibly be? It will be a Bantustan. It will be the site for further conflict. So there needs to be justice. And I think, again, the way forward towards some kind of justice is UN Resolutions 242, which calls for complete Israeli withdrawal to the borders, pre-1967 borders. That includes the Golan Heights. That includes East Jerusalem, which was annexed over a UN Security Council resolution. Those are the ways forward. And so what is preventing that? Total Washington intransigence, total Washington support for Tel Aviv's policies of annexation and land confiscation and housing demolitions.
Thanks for your call, Dan. We've got a couple other folks on the line. This is Greg. Hi, Greg. You're on with David Barsamian.
Hi,
Sam and David. It's great to hear you guys. This is a fascinating discussion. I think one of the things that the corporate media misses all the time is history. And I was wondering, there's a long history of Shia-Sunni conflict or disagreement, but it seems like it was never... There haven't been Sunni and Shia civil wars, have there? If you could just go into that history a little bit more, David, I think that'd be really helpful to people. And I'm going to take my answer off the air. Thanks.
Good morning. Thanks for calling, Greg. Well, the Shia-Sunni divide in Islam starts right at the very beginning of the religion, actually, with the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632 A.D. There was one group that believed that Imam Ali, the son-in-law and first cousin of the Prophet, who was married to Fatima, the Prophet's daughter, should be the first leader of the Ummah, the Islamic community. Another group felt that the leadership should be based on not issues of blood and family relations to the Prophet Muhammad, and they are the Sunnis, the Ahl Sunnah. And so this was the divide. It was pretty sharp at the time, and it's difficult to condense a lot of historical information, but there isn't a lot of evidence for Shia-Sunni civil wars, for example. Nothing on the scale of what the Europeans went through in the Middle Ages with the Catholics and the Protestants. In Iraq, there has been no Shia-Sunni conflict known in any time in recent history. This has been a direct result of the invasion. It has been a direct result of U.S. policy to divide and conquer and rule Iraq, to keep it as essentially a weak state. And of course, it's not quite working out that way because of various resistance. People don't find occupation pleasurable. That's the simple and bald truth of it. Like my friend Mahmoud that I met in Damascus, he didn't like the Americans. He hates the American soldiers. He doesn't like the fact that his country is being occupied by people that can't speak Arabic, that have no interest or knowledge of Islam or Islamic civilization or culture or history or any of these things. And so the Shia-Sunni issue now is real. There is now a divide in Iraq which did not exist before. Many of the refugees that have fled the country, incidentally, were of mixed marriages, which was quite prevalent in Iraq. Shias marrying Sunnis, Sunnis marrying Shias. I also didn't mention the tragedy of the Christian minority in Iraq. One of the oldest Christian communities in the world, Assyrians, Armenians, Chaldeans, and others, Mandeans, have many of their churches have been destroyed, their seminaries, they've had to flee the country. This is a great tragedy, and again, rarely pointed out, not mentioned at all by the Christian fundamentalist media here, which has hundreds of TV and radio stations and newspapers and newsletters and commands the pulpits of churches all across the country. I mean, they seem to take a great deal of interest in certain Christian communities, but not Arab Christian communities, which I think has a very racist undertone to it. Why not? Are they different from people in white countries?
Let's go back to the phone. Sandra from Denver is holding. Hi, Sandra. You're on the air.
Yes. A question, David. I think what you're saying is so important for us to hear in your trip. I'm very, very glad to hear all that you're learning, and you're so positive about what you're learning. But frankly, I'm getting so depressed to learn more and more of what is being done in my country's name with my money as well as all my friends' money. Is there anything we can do besides just learn more from people like you? And write letters to the editor and call our Congress people and people who are pretty liberal Democrats like Mark Udall and so on, but who are in many ways, although they're Democrats tied in with this bumbling regime of Bush, I don't see the Democrats will do anything much different when and if they come to power. What can we as individuals who are caring but also really increasingly discouraged by what is being done in our name to keep from just either totally turning off, becoming complete cynics, or what? I'm looking for signs of hope from people like you, David, and I'll take my answer off the air. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for that question. And of course, it comes up all the time. I would say to cite Eduardo Galeano, the great Uruguayan writer, let us save pessimism for better times. This is not a moment for negativity or cynicism. And of course, everything in the culture, the media culture in particular, contributes to that with its endless fascinations with Britney Spears and Anna Nicole Smith and Paris Hilton and on and on. It's very hard not to get cynical. It's very hard to resist pessimism. Clearly in the face of one of the most lawless regimes in U.S. history. And, the bar is pretty high. I remember the Nixon. I'm old enough to remember the Nixon regime, which was a major lawbreaker. But certainly since then, nothing comes close to what we have right now in Washington. I think it's important to do things for yourself, to eat well, to drink lots of water, to do yoga, to hike, to bike, but also, just taking care of the body, the physical machine, but also to find kindred spirits, to link up, to connect. So to overcome this feeling of being atomized, it's just me, I'm in front of my computer, I'm in front of the TV, I'm in front of the radio, and, you're kind of being acted upon. It's really critical to get involved with groups such as the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center here in Boulder, such as Colorado Jews for Peace and Justice in Denver, other organizations, peace groups, the Denver Peace and Justice Committee in Denver. I did a talk for them at the Mercury Cafe a couple of months ago. When you find kindred spirits, you feel fortified, you feel affirmed. It's not just me thinking these things, but there are other people. And then other people that are taking actions. For example, last night or yesterday in the afternoon, there was a major march from the public library here in Boulder down to the mall, to the courthouse, opposing the war in Iraq and calling for defunding. You mentioned Mark Udall, the liberal Democratic representative from Boulder, who is aspiring to be the next senator from this state. He says, and I believe him, that he is opposed to the war. Nevertheless, he, like many of his colleagues, continue to fund it. There seems to be a little disconnect there. How can you be against a policy but continue to enable it by passing legislation to fund it? So I think this is a very, very important issue. Yes, we need information. We need to be informed. I want you to listen to, KGNU. I want you to, read my book on Iran. I want you to, listen to Amy Goodman and do all of these things. But to take some action. Yes, writing letters is important, but I think marching, boycotting, products and companies that support the war machine is something that individuals can do, but also has more impact when it is a collective action. I think through collectivity, we achieve power. That is how social change has always happened in the United States. It wasn't one-off operations in the 1960s that ended apartheid in this country. It was collective action. It wasn't one person refusing to sit down at a lunch counter or refusing to get on a bus. It was many, many people organizing, working together. This is so important.
Let's take another call. This is Neil. Neil, you're on with David Barsamian.
Welcome home, David.
Thank you.
I had a question, but I want to make a quick comment referring to Iraq and Shia and Sunnis. Under the Ba'ath regime, Shia role in Iraqi history was underplayed, if not completely erased, even though that same educational system was represented by Shias who were forced to play a certain role. It would seem to me, I went to school in Yugoslavia during the Tito regime, and you found the same emphasis on one people's role in Yugoslav history as opposed to another. And there is evidence, certainly in Iraq under the Ba'ath regime, of a deep Shia resentment to being treated as a second-class citizens, of having played absolutely no role in Iraqi history. And so there is a foundation for resentment in Iraq along sectarian lines, simply because the education system was weighted toward favoring Sunnis. That was my first comment.
And I don't mean to rush you along, Neil, but we're running out of time.
Okay. When you spoke to people in the academic field or the so-called liberal professions in Iraq, lawyers, accountants, doctors, and they objected to the American presence. Could you make it clear when you spoke to them? Did they object to the American invasion, or did they object to the method of occupation?
It was a little bit of both, actually. There was some of them totally opposed to the invasion, and others that found the occupation obnoxious, way too long, and extremely inept in terms of its administration. Again, to speak clearly, there is no functioning government in Iraq today. There is a green zone, and the rest of the country is called a red zone. And the writ of the government barely exceeds the green zone. It is true, as you point out, that under the Ba'ath regime of Saddam Hussein, incidentally, Syria also comes from the same ideological roots, the Ba'ath Party. Yet Syria and Iraq, brother Arab countries, have been at loggerheads for years. And you'll recall that in the 1991 Gulf War, Syria actually participated, along with the United States and the coalition, to oust Iraq from Kuwait. So the Ba'ath regime in Baghdad, which came to power in a coup in 1963 that was supported by the CIA, incidentally, because the ruler at the time was an Arab nationalist who wanted to, keep the U.S. out of the region. And he was also somewhat friendly to the Soviet Union. So immediately that, Cold War prism was imposed on that paradigm, and there was a coup. The left was completely demolished and smashed. The CIA gave the lists to Saddam Hussein and his cohorts to assassinate the rather strong Communist Party inside of Iraq. Again, a little bit of, the history that's buried. There's good information on this in Tariq Ali's book called Bush in Babylon. To the previous question also, and now that my tape is rolling full steam here, questions to learn about Shia Islam and Sunni Islam and Islam in general. There are a couple of good books out written by people from the region. One is by Vali Nasr. His last name is Nasr, and it's called The Shia Revival. It's quite good in when it's discussing Islam. When it discusses U.S. Policy in the Middle East, I believe it's very naive and conventional. But in terms of describing the Shia-Sunni divide and basic tenets of Islam, it's very, very good. There's also another good book written by a young Iranian American academic. His name is Reza Aslan, A-S-L-A-N. It's called No God But God. These are both available in paperback, as is Tariq Ali's very good book, Bush in Babylon.
David Barsamian is our guest from Alternative Radio, just back from a trip to Lebanon, Syria, and Turkey. And I hope we'll have a few minutes to talk about Turkey before we wrap up. But let's take a call from Jim in Longmont. Hi, Jim.
Hi. I'd just like to echo David's comments about boycott. The war, corporations are making money from the war. Corporations control our politicians. They control the media. They send us messages all the time. we need to attack the corporate structure. Don't spend your money. Don't buy corporate stuff that you don't need. Don't buy gasoline. Buy food that's produced locally. Starve the corporations. And I guess that's about it. Thanks.
Thank you, Jim.
In terms of what people can do, I want to refer back to the woman who had called from Denver, who said, she was experiencing some pessimism, which is understandable, of course. I think it's very important to talk to young people right now because they're very vulnerable to the militarism, to the jingoism, to the patriotic cells that are going on in the junior high schools and the high schools when these paladins of putative virtue visit them and try and seduce them and hook them into joining the army, serving their country. Of course, everyone wants to serve their country. I don't denigrate this, but they're not serving their country in the Middle East. They're serving Halliburton and ExxonMobil and Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman and Getty and Chevron, Texaco, and all of these other large corporations. If they were to say that, then young people would have a better understanding of what they're getting into. Rather, these recruiters are dangling, wads of money in front of them. They're literally bribing these kids. You're in debt. You want to get out of debt. You want to learn how to repair, automobile engines. We'll train you. You want to learn how to repair a computer. We'll train you. You want to fly a helicopter. We'll train you. We'll give you education. It's all upbeat. It's all wonderful. It's all great. You might even travel a little bit, see the world. No one's going to get their head blown off. No one's going to lose their arms or legs. It's all about, this very positive thing of serving your country. I think we really need to look at what patriotism means and what role dissent plays in patriotism. I think the highest form of patriotism is to demur, is to reject government policy when it is unjust, when it is criminal. And we are facing criminality now. And the fact that the Democratic Party refuses or is unwilling to initiate impeachment hearings against members of this administration and former members of this administration, including Colin Powell and Donald Rumsfeld and Douglas Feith, is very, very disturbing. What is required to bring evidence that there have been a number of high crimes and misdemeanors? What is needed? Are people in this audience not old enough to remember that Bill Clinton was in fact impeached, was not convicted for an adulterous affair? Of course, we can be very virtuous about that, and we're all very pure and have never done anything wrong. But how does that compare? Again, the scale of launching wars of aggression against Afghanistan, which again is never talked about, which is also seriously spiraling out of control. The Iraq techniques are now being imported into Afghanistan as well. The Nancy Pelosi, attracted a lot of positive attention when she was elected Speaker of the House. But one of the first things she did was to say that impeachment was off the table. And then on the Iraq war funding bill, she, for some reasons that are not yet clear, removed a passage which said that the Bush administration could not attack Iran without congressional approval. Now, why was that removed? And under whose urging was that taken out of that particular legislation?
Before we run out of time, I want to ask you about Turkey. You were there on the heels of a controversial campaign season, if you will, where a popular Islamist candidate was essentially told by the military, don't run. What's your perspective on that?
Well, first of all, it was really interesting to learn how badly misreported the massive demonstrations were that were held in Turkey in May and in early June. They were in the three biggest cities, Ankara, the capital, Istanbul, the largest city, and Izmir on the Aegean Sea. Hundreds of thousands, if not certainly several million Turks turned out. And I, like every other citizen, just took in the media reports. This was Turkish democracy at work. This was an expression of, liberal impulses, and it seemed very, very positive. I couldn't have been more badly mistaken, as person after person told me. These were largely reactionary, fascist formations that had turned out, prodded by the military, who are threatening, who are in fact even encouraging a military coup to prevent any kind of Islamic tinge to Turkey's government. And so it was very interesting for me to learn that. I mean, the political situation inside Turkey today, the military, there is something called the deep state, which essentially runs everything, and that is the military in league with large corporations. Does that sound like a familiar theme that might occur elsewhere? And this deep state, for example, carried out the assassination of Hrant Dink, Turkey's most prominent Armenian journalist, who was murdered in January of this year. That was carried out supposedly by Turkish nationalists. So there's a struggle inside of Turkey, but it's between the military and Islamic groups that want to impose more of an Islamic character on the Turkish state. It is basically a secular state. There's also very disturbing reports that the military wants to attack Iraq because there's a Kurdish population in northern Iraq. The Turkish military claims that they're crossing the border and carrying out raids and operations inside of southeastern Turkey, which is overwhelmingly Kurdish, which was the site of a major rebellion in the 1980s and 1990s. Tens of thousands of mostly Kurds were killed. 2 to 3 million refugees were created internally because approximately 4,000 to 5,000 villages were razed to the ground. So when I'm in Istanbul, which is where I was last week, and to ask people, well, where are you from? And they all say they're from Anatolia. They're from southeastern Turkey. When did you come here? Oh, in the 1980s and 1990s. And then it became clear what the pattern of oppression produced in Turkey. So the situation is very muddled in Turkey today. It's not clear, in what direction the country is going. It looks like the EU membership is not going to happen because Sarkozy, the newly elected president of France, is absolutely against Turkish membership in the European Union. He says things like Turkey does not represent European values. God only knows what that might mean. But that might have a very negative effect inside of Turkey. It will probably encourage the nationalists who are saying, who are against European Union membership all along, who are saying, we're not Europeans, we're not white, we're not Christian, we have nothing to do with them. To do with them. We are Muslims, we are Turkish nationalists. So they may, draw in tighter into that cocoon and become more emboldened to carry that out. I also spent some time with the small Jewish community in Istanbul. There are about 15,000 Jews left there. They're, pretty nervous, as are the Armenians, who are about 80,000. There are a few thousand Greeks left. All of them feel very threatened by the rise of this kind of Turkic Islamic nationalism.
We'll try to get in one more very quick call from Sarah, and I apologize to the other callers we weren't able to get to. But Sarah, you'll have the last comment for David Barsamian.
Great, thanks. It's funny because I thought the moment was going to be lost, but he touched back on the woman who called from Denver. And I wanted to say it was a perfect plug to support KGNU and free speech and donating money or time or volunteering and maybe working on outreach to Denver and surrounding areas to bring it to them, and carrying the intention with you, that Paul Hawkins, I know so many books have been named, but Blessed Unrest was a good intention message. And thank you, David. It is, I know, been reiterated so many times, but it's great to have you here and just sharing it with people.
Thank you, Sarah. And we always echo that comment that when you tell a friend or a coworker or anybody to listen to KGNU, that is our best form of outreach. Thank you for bringing that up. But thank you, David Barsamian. As always, the new book is called Targeting Iran.